Mud splashed across the hem of her dress as Emily stumbled up the hill, her shoes torn and barely clinging to her feet. The white satin that once shimmered like a dream was now streaked with brown, and the veil she'd so carefully pinned that morning fluttered in tatters behind her. The wind tugged at her hair, and every step burned, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not after what had just happened. Somewhere beyond the ridge, where the earth rolled into the horizon, stood the man who had chosen her, not for her looks, her family, or her fortune, but for something she could no longer even see in herself. And as she reached the wooden gate of the small ranch chapel, the man waiting there, a rugged cowboy with sun-weathered hands and eyes too kind for his own good, looked down at her ruined shoes and simply said, with a half-smile that broke her heart open, "Then you've brought everything." Emily hadn't always been the kind of woman who ran barefoot toward love. She had been the kind of girl who believed in perfection, the right dress, the right flowers, the right promise. She'd been raised in a family that measured worth by appearances. Her mother's mirror was her first teacher, her father's silence was her second. When she met Paul, a banker's son with a clean suit and practiced smile, it seemed her future had been drawn for her, a respectable life, a big house, polite dinners, and no space for imperfection. But then came Daniel. Daniel was the cowboy who worked her father's land during the summers. He didn't belong in her world, he never even tried to. His shirts were always rolled to the elbows, his hands carried the scent of soil and leather, and his words, few as they were, had a way of cutting through the noise of everything false. The first time Emily had seen him, he'd been repairing a fence post under the afternoon sun. He hadn't looked up when she passed, and that had unsettled her more than she expected. Everyone always looked. But not him. She started finding excuses to walk that way, first to check on the crops, then to bring lemonade to the workers, then just to watch. Slowly, conversations turned into laughter, and laughter turned into the kind of silence that said more than words could. Daniel had a way of seeing her as though he could look straight through the layers she wore to please others. Once, when she complained that her mother said she wasn't graceful enough to dance properly, he'd chuckled and said, "Then maybe the music's wrong, not you." By the time her family found out, it was too late. They called her foolish. Her father said Daniel had nothing, no money, no name, no future worth tying hers to. Her mother wept, not out of sadness but out of pride, wounded by the thought of her daughter choosing a ranch hand over a banker. They gave her a choice, leave Daniel, or leave the family. The day she left home, the sky was gray. She carried only a single suitcase and a trembling heart. Daniel met her by the old oak at the edge of the ranch. "You sure about this?" he'd asked softly. She'd nodded, but her voice cracked when she said yes. Together, they built a life out of very little. A small cabin with creaky floors, laughter that echoed even when they had nothing to eat but bread, and dreams whispered under the same blanket when the nights got cold. But love isn't free of storms. Months later, Daniel was thrown from a horse. His injuries left him with a limp, unable to work the ranch the way he used to. The bills grew. The winter came early that year. Emily tried sewing for the townsfolk, washing clothes, anything to keep them afloat. Some nights, she sat by the fire staring at the calluses on her hands, wondering if love alone could still be enough, and then came the letter her parents had written, offering her a way back, a life of security, comfort, and everything she'd once been taught to want. There was a catch, of course. "You can come home," her mother wrote, "but not as Mrs. Carter." She read the letter again and again until the ink blurred with her tears. The morning she left, she didn't tell Daniel why. She only said she had to go. He didn't stop her. He just looked at her the way he had that first day, steady and quiet, as though he already knew this wasn't goodbye forever. Weeks passed before she realized what she'd done. The silks and chandeliers of her parents' home felt colder than any winter she'd endured. No one spoke of Daniel, but sometimes her mother caught her staring out the window, and the silence between them said everything. Emily finally understood what her mother would never say, that love like that frightened people who had never been brave enough to find it. On the night she fled again, back toward Daniel, back toward the only truth she'd ever known, the rain poured hard enough to drown out her doubts. The wagon she'd borrowed got stuck halfway through the fields, and she ran the rest of the way, her shoes tearing open with every mile. By the time she reached the chapel by the ranch, she was soaked to the bone, breathless, trembling. She didn't even know if Daniel would be there, but he was. Standing in the doorway, waiting, when he looked down at her torn shoes and mud-stained dress, she expected anger or hurt. Instead, he smiled, softly, like forgiveness, and said, "Then you've brought everything." She broke then, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of realizing she was home. He stepped forward, his rough hands cradling her face as though she was something delicate, not something ruined. "You think I ever wanted the perfect version of you?" he whispered. "I just wanted the real one." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she nodded, because she finally understood that love didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to endure. They married that evening, barefoot, with only the stars and the sound of rain against the roof as witnesses. Years later, when people asked how they'd built such a strong marriage through so much hardship, Daniel would always smile and say, "She came to me with nothing but torn shoes. And I knew right then, that's everything love ever needs to start." And somewhere, between the broken roads and the stitched-together dreams, Emily learned that sometimes you have to lose everything false to find the one thing true, that love, in all its simple, stubborn grace, is never about what you bring. It's about who you become when you stay.